Ever feel like you're drowning in data? Like when you're prepping for a data science interview or tackling a personal project, you've got spreadsheets everywhere. Python scripts are just sprawling out of control. It's a mess. But what if there was like a way to wrangle all that data chaos, make your code cleaner, and, actually enjoy the process?
Well, there is, and then that we're diving into today, the magic of method chaining in pandas.
Okay, magic might be pushing it a little. But I have to admit, when I first discovered method chaining, it really did feel like a revelation. It's this elegant way to write code that just flows. Instead of having lines and lines of separate commands, you can chain them together in a way that almost reads like a sentence.
That's a great way to put it. Method chaining isn't just about making your code look pretty. It's about fundamentally changing how you approach data transformation. It's like taking a jumbled toolbox and organizing it into a smooth, step-by-step workflow.
And you know me, I'm all about that organization. But let's get specific. What are the real-world benefits here? Why should someone listening right now care about method chaining?
I'm glad you asked. One of the biggest wins is readability. Think about those monster scripts you mentioned earlier. Trying to debug those is a nightmare. With method chaining, each step in your data manipulation is crystal clear, which makes finding and fixing errors so much easier.
So it's not just about making things look neat. It actually helps you think about your data steps more logically and avoid mistakes. That's huge.
Exactly. And this logical flow also makes your code more concise. You're not wasting time with temporary variables and redundant lines of code. It's all streamlined and efficient.
And hold on, didn't our source material have an example showing this before and after? I remember seeing that, and my jaw basically hit the floor. The chained version was like a quarter of the length.
Right. And it wasn't just shorter, it was understandable. Even someone who wasn't familiar with the project could look at that code and immediately grasp what it was doing.
Now, I do have to play devil's advocate here. I've heard some folks say debugging long chains can be tricky. Like if something breaks, how do you know where in the chain it happened?
That's a valid concern, and it's where the balance comes in. Method chaining is powerful, but like any tool, it needs to be used thoughtfully. If you find a chain is getting too long or complex, you can always break it down into smaller, more manageable chunks. It's about finding that sweet spot between conciseness and clarity.
So it's not an all-or-nothing thing. You can still leverage the power of chaining without sacrificing readability.
Precisely. And another thing to keep in mind is that not every pandas method is designed for chaining. Some methods might not return a data frame, which is kind of the backbone of chaining.
Wait, hold on. Can you unpack that a bit? Why does it matter if a method returns a data frame or not?
Sure, each method in a chain needs to take the output of the previous method and use it as its own input. It's like a relay race. Each runner needs to pass the baton cleanly to the next. If a method doesn't return a data frame, you're essentially breaking that chain.
Ah, that makes sense. It's like trying to pass a basketball to someone expecting a football. The game just stops.
Exactly. So it's crucial to be aware of these potential hiccups and handle them gracefully. But don't worry, with a bit of practice, it becomes second nature.
So we've talked about the why, the how, and the potential pitfalls. But I'm itching to see this in action. Our source mentioned something about flight data.
Yes, they used a really interesting example with flight data to illustrate the power of chaining. Are you ready to take off?
All right, so we're cleared for takeoff with this flight data example. Can you set the scene for us? What kind of data are we dealing with here?
Imagine you have this massive spreadsheet, rows and rows of flight information. You've got flight numbers, origins, destinations, departure times, the works. It's the kind of data set you might encounter if you were working for like an airline, a travel agency, or even just analyzing flight trends for fun.
Okay, I can see that getting messy quickly. But how does method chaining help us make sense of all that information?
Well, let's say you want to analyze flight delays. Without method chaining, you'd have to write like separate chunks of code to read the data, clean it up, extract the relevant columns, maybe calculate some new values, and then finally filter down to the flights you're interested in. It'd be a lot of jumping back and forth, a lot of temporary variables cluttering up your code.
And a lot of chances to introduce errors. I can already feel the headache coming on.
But with method chaining, you can express that entire workflow as a single elegant chain. It's like creating a data assembly line. Each method takes the output of the previous one and transforms it in some way.
So instead of writing separate instructions for each step, we're creating a smooth flowing recipe for our data. I like that.
And the best part is, as you build this chain, you're not just seeing the code, you're understanding the intent behind each step. It's like reading a story about your data.
Our source mentioned using the assign method in this example. What's so special about that?
Assign is like a superpower. It lets you create new columns on the fly based on existing data, or even by applying custom calculations.
So in this flight data scenario, could we use assign to create a column that tells us the distance of each flight.
Absolutely. You could grab the latitude and longitude of the origin and destination, and then use a formula within a sign to calculate the distance between those points. It's like having a mini spreadsheet formula embedded right in your code.
Wow, that's pretty slick. And I remember our source also mentioned something about lambda functions being used with a sign. To be honest, lambdas always felt a bit mysterious to me. Can you demystify them a bit?
Of course. Think of lambdas as tiny anonymous functions that you can define right within your code. They're perfect for those situations where you need a quick calculation or transformation without writing out a whole separate function.
So it's like having a little helper function that you can summon whenever you need it, without cluttering up your main code.
Exactly. And in this flight data example, you might use a lambda function within a sign to extract the city name from the origin and destination columns. Maybe you only have the full airport code and want to pull out the city for easier analysis.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together. We're reading in the data, using a sign to add new columns and calculate values, maybe using some lambda functions for quick transformations. What else can we do?
Well, after enriching our data, we might want to start filtering it down. Maybe we're only interested in flights longer than a certain duration, or flights to a particular region. That's where the query method comes in.
Query. It's like having a built-in search engine for your data.
Exactly. You can use simple Boolean expressions like distance greater than 500 to select only the rows that meet your criteria. And the beauty is you can chain query right after your other methods, so the filtering happens seamlessly within the same flow.
So we're creating new columns, calculating values, filtering the data. It really is like a data assembly line. And each step builds on the one before making the entire process so much more efficient.
And don't forget the readability factor. Imagine trying to debug a script where all these operations are scattered across hundreds of lines of code. With method chaining, you have a clear and concise record of every transformation that's happened to your data.
That's peace of mind right there. It's like having a well-documented lab notebook. So you can always retrace your steps and understand how you arrived at your results. So we've walked through this flight data example. And I have to say, I'm really starting to see the appeal of method chaining. It's like taking this tangled web of data manipulation and turning it into like a streamlined process. But before we wrap up, I want to make sure we bring it back to our listener. You're out there, you've got your own data challenges. How can you start using this in your own work?
That's the exciting part. The possibilities are truly endless. Think about the kinds of tasks you do regularly with your data. Are you cleaning messy spreadsheets, combining data from different sources, calculating new values, or creating custom metrics? Chances are you can use method chaining to make those tasks faster, easier, and more enjoyable.
It's like leveling up your data manipulation skills. And I know our source material mentioned a whole bunch of other chainable methods besides the ones we've talked about. There's rename, .filter, .groupby, .ignite.apply. It's a bit overwhelming.
It can feel that way at first, but the key is to start small. Don't try to master every method at once. Pick one or two that seem relevant to your work and experiment with them. See how they behave, how they interact with each other. The more you play around with it, the more intuitive it becomes.
And remember, the Pandas documentation is your friend. It's a treasure trove of information and examples. Don't be afraid to dive in and explore.
Absolutely. And don't underestimate the power of online communities. There are forums and groups dedicated to pandas and data science, where you can connect with other folks, share your challenges, and get inspiration.
It's all about finding what works for you, building your toolkit, and gradually incorporating method chaining into your workflow. It doesn't have to be an overnight transformation.
Exactly. It's a journey, and it's one worth taking because the payoff is huge. Once you get comfortable with method chaining, you'll wonder how you ever lived without it.
So to recap our deep dive, method chaining is this powerful technique for transforming your data in Pandas. It makes your code more readable, more concise, and easier to maintain. It's not a magic bullet, but it's a game changer.
And it's a skill that will serve you well no matter what kind of data work you do. So go forth, experiment, and embrace the elegance of method chaining. 20 say I.